This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders. Today, I'm honored to have Brian Taptich on the show. And we're going to talk about his career leading up to where he is now as VP of Strategic Initiatives at AWS. We'll talk a little bit about his first time as a CEO and lots of other things that can be useful when it comes to growing our leadership. We're going to talk about culture and all kinds of good stuff. Anyway, with all that being said, Tap, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. We were chatting a bit beforehand, and I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts, and you've just had such interesting people. So I'm hopeful I can hit the bar.
I'm sure it'll be great. If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into tech leadership and what is it that you're doing today?
Yeah, it's been a journey. So I graduated from Williams College in 1992 with degrees in psychology and English literature, which explains why I manage large engineering organizations now. And I spent there's sort of two major phases in my career, and maybe this is applicable to everybody's career. The first was sort of figuring out what it is that I wanted to do, and then the second was doing it. And those first 10 years started with a full existential freak out right out of college, where I ended up buying a motorcycle and spending a year traveling around the States. And then I had never lived overseas, so I went and I taught English in Japan. And I was entirely sure when I got back from Japan that I was going to write the next great American novel. Instead, I ended up getting a job in San Francisco at a small startup magazine called Red Herring, which you said you've been around for 30 years, so you might remember.
I don't recall Red Herring.
Yeah, it was one of the sort of tech Bibles in Silicon Valley, and that was a crazy ride. And this was right after kind of Netscape launched their browser and kind of opened up the web to everybody. And it was that peak, Web 1.0, pets.com phase of the internet. And ended up
all those good stuff.
Yeah, all the stuff. It was quite a wild ride, and was an editor there, and ended up leaving there as one was wont to do back then to start our own company. So I started a print and web. I co-founded a print and web media company that we raised a bunch of money and then ran, headlong like a lot of people did into the sort of Web 1.0 bust. At which point I decided to go back to business school, and that was really sort of the end of phase one. And that, at business school, went to Kellogg and at Northwestern, and really focused on building out, some of the muscles that I hadn't really developed to that point, primarily on the sort of the finance and accounting and strategy side of things, and came out of school and was much more intentional kind of since the turn of the century on my career and how I thought about things. And, since then, sort of the jobs that led to my current position at AWS were, I went to Electronic Arts and I worked for EA Sports doing product and business development. I got recruited away from there to help run a company called BitTorrent, which if you're of a certain age, you use to do things.
Oh, never used it. I don't know. Don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, only used it legally. Well, the irony of BitTorrent, of course, is that people use it for what they use it for. But it's actually a wonderful technical architecture. And, especially these were the days pre-streaming, if you can remember way back then, where everything was about downloading. And so having this mediated peer-to-peer architecture was actually really elegant. And we ended up taking the technology and turning it into kind of an enterprise-grade version that then we sold to companies. At that point, though, I ended up leaving to join a startup called Zynga, which was back in the games industry, who did things like Farmville and Words with Friends. and I was running all of their international business and operations. And at that point, I kind of, the next step in the evolution was to kind of take the big job as CEO. And I was fortunate enough to get recruited into a job for a company called BitCasa, which had built some very interesting file system services technology all on top of AWS. And we turned that ship around and ended up selling the company. I didn't end up joining the acquiring company Intel because I didn't want to work for a large company. And then two months later ended up at AWS, which I think at the time was probably 3 times as large. So it's been a journey, and couldn't be happier with kind of where I've landed and wouldn't do it differently.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about that experience at BitCasa, because I heard a story that it started out kind of on a rough start.
Yeah, well, unbeknownst to me. So I'd worked with some of their early stage investors, and the company had some really interesting technology, but a pretty broken go-to-market strategy. And I ended up leaving a perfectly delightful job at Zyngo, running all of their international business and operations, which I had helped build, and took the CEO job. And I was very excited. And I think it was day 5 or 6 where I had to call an emergency board meeting and tell them that the company was insolvent, because as we sort of sifted through all of the murky documents that had been left behind by the founder CEO, discovered that the millions of dollars we owed AWS was significantly greater than the millions of dollars that we had in the bank. And so that was, as you might imagine, a pretty hairy moment. And I went to the board and I said, hey, look, I think there's a really big opportunity here. It's going to take some additional funding, and it's going to take going to AWS and talking to them with hat in hand. But I think there's an opportunity here, and some combination of our ending up kind of pivoting and coming up with sort of a new strategy, plus our board members being very generous and patient, and plus AWS also being very generous and patient. We ended up with a pretty good outcome in the end.
So how much fear did you have going into that board meeting, being the new guy on the job that has to deliver the terrible news? And what was the initial result? Like, was it like, well, I'm fired, I'm getting a new job? Or was it more like, okay, I think we've got something here. I think we can turn this around?
Yeah. So it's interesting you to ask. I was way more fearful coming into day 1 of the job than I was day 7 when I had to go in front of the board, because, you spend a lot of time thinking about someday potentially being a CEO. And then the night before you actually take over the job, you realize, oh my God, I'm now it. Like the buck stops here. And so there is a certain kind of weight and gravity that comes with that. Frankly, my reaction when we sort of discovered that the board was insolvent, or that the company was insolvent, I was more, I sort of wasn't really responsible for it. So I went to the board. I said, so the way I felt going into the board meeting was, look, I'm not like, this is somebody else's mess, and I'm here and I can try and help and clean this up. But it's not like I'm going in sheepishly and saying like, hey, guess what? I screwed up and we're bankrupt. It was, hey, look, here's a problem. I think we can find a solution to it. But really, even more than my company, because I'm 5 days invested in this thing, not 5 years, this is really your company, both you, the board, and you, the employees. What do you want to do? And so I still was sort of, I think, emotionally distanced enough for it where I didn't really get nervous. I was just kind of could be super pragmatic about it, which in the end probably helped, because there's sort of enough drama and that you don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to, when you're amplifying that drama, not sort of helping mitigate it,
Yeah, absolutely. So what kind of changes did you have to make, like right off the bat, to kind of fix that? Because, I hear about, getting the right people in place, or cutting cost, or changing our strategy, changing sales, changing our pricing, or is it more like a culture? What was the actual shift?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above. And it starts as ever. There's sort of this order of operations. And the first step, as ever, is like, so what's your strategy? What if this if this path that we were going on isn't the right path and we have to pivot, what is the new path? And do we think that makes sense? And, it's mapping, your product capabilities with your go-to-market capabilities with, the underlying IP and capabilities of the technology, and just deciding like, okay, look, is there a different direction we can be taking this, or are we inexorably down this single path and there's no way to kind of come back from it? So step one is develop your strategy. And that was a lot of very late nights with the existing leadership team. Needless to say, the board wanted to be very involved in those discussions as well, given though they were going to be the ones that were going to have to fund the whole thing. Step two then is, okay, if we're all aligned on this is the right strategy and here's the direction we want to go with the product, with the go-to-market piece, how do we put ourselves in a position to be successful? And, shoring up the balance sheet was going to be very obvious step two. One of that was on the money owed side of the equation, going to AWS with hat in hand and saying, hey, look, we don't have the ability to sort of pay the bill that was accrued here. And again, back to your question about being nervous, not nervous for that meeting because I didn't accrue the bill. It was really like, hey, look, I'm trying to fix the problem here. And again, they were, especially back then, people lose sight of the fact that AWS is now this amazing resource that, everybody from, that most of the large enterprises in the world are using, to get off their on-premises infrastructure. Well, the seeds for AWS were very much sown in kind of the startup world. And so now this was probably, 10, 12 years ago, walking into AWS as a startup saying, look, we have a couple of options here. One is we can go out of business, in which case nobody gets paid, or we can, try and fix this problem and, get you paid at some point over time. And to their credit, and I say this as an employee now, but then obviously as a consumer, as a customer, like they were incredibly customer centric and really willing to work with us to figure out how to make this work rather than just have us walk away. And so that was kind of step two. And then step three is, make sure you have the right people in place. And for Bitcasa, this was a challenge because, we were pivoting very much from kind of a B2C proposition into a more enterprise focused proposition. And so it just required everything from, the good news is the underlying core IP was the same, but, kind of everything up the stack from there, from the user experience to all the go-to-market folks, required some pretty serious turnover. And so there was definite trauma inflicted there that needed to be managed.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's got to be a big shift going from B2C to more enterprise type product. So tell me a little bit about, you went through this, you kind of turned the ship around, had a business that you kind of transformed a little bit, were able to, pay off the debt, I guess you would say, and then sell the business. And you didn't want to go to Intel mainly because large company, I guess you probably fell in love with the startup type environment, the smaller businesses and growing things around. What then would attract you to go to AWS?
Yeah, well, so AWS rang after kind of the transaction was done and said that, they had this very difficult job that they needed filled, which was, kind of, they needed somebody who really understood games, which I did, and somebody who really understood bits. And between Bitcasa and BitTorrent, like I was kind of the guy. And I remember at the time, the hiring, I went through the whole recruiting process at Amazon, and I think Amazon does a very good job of, through the process, making you understand what it is going to feel like to work at Amazon, at AWS. And so I think the flyer that I took was, I know this is a massive company, but their belief in things like single-threaded ownership, I should say our belief in things like single-threaded ownership, gives you the autonomy within this extremely large organization to kind of work independently and without dependencies on, whether it's other services that are being developed or other products or other go-to-market strategies, you're very much kind of left to your own devices to succeed or not succeed. And so, that was the vibe I had. And the good news is now 6 years later, it's kind of proved to be true.
Well, that's good. So I think ownership and accountability are kind of two of the things that I struggle with when I think about large companies versus smaller companies. In a large company, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for people to kind of pass blame or and ownership over to other people when things go wrong, and there's not a whole lot of that accountability. And I'm a fan of Jocko Willink. He wrote the book Extreme Ownership, where he talks about taking ownership. And how have you at AWS been able to kind of have that ownership aspect?
Yeah, and this gets at kind of the core of Amazon and AWS and the way in which they run the business. And this gets at really the importance of any company, whether it's a startup or over 1 million employee company like Amazon. It's the strength of your culture that ultimately is going to define how people are able to operate within that culture. And so, at Amazon, we have our 16 leadership principles, which, kind of start with customer obsession and end with Earth's best employer and deliver results. And then there are a handful in between, like think big and ownership. And, I've worked at companies before that had some similar version of this, but didn't actually live by them. They were just good fodder for, posters on the wall or coasters on your desk or mouse pads or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. But Amazon really lives by them, right? And so these are really kind of fundamental tenets to the way everybody, operates the business. And then you layer on top of that these higher order concepts around like single-threaded ownership and these lack of dependencies on what other folks are doing. The annual planning process, which we call our OP process, our operating plan process, where instead of thinking about, quarterly results or, how you're going to make the next buck, every single meeting that I've been in since I've been at AWS, like different than almost everywhere I've ever worked, the first question is never how much money do we think we're going to make from this. Instead, it's what's the customer problem what's the big customer problem we think we're going to solve? The premise being that if we solve that problem, then the money will just sort of logically come after that. And so they just have this culture in place where there's no point at which you really feel like you're working for, a company that employs over 1 million people. You're very focused on what you're doing. They have the mechanisms in place for you to very clearly articulate what you're going to accomplish. And then you get the freedom to go off and accomplish them. And either you're successful and you get to keep going, or you don't, and you figure out something else to do.
So, I think that's great to hear about that culture. And, I love the fact that you're not coming in with a solution and just immediately going straight to the ROI question, which is where a lot of companies do that. And I remember back at a company that I worked at, an ISP that I was a manager at, we had to go into budgets, and it was almost like you had to pitch your idea versus someone else's idea of which one was going to have the better ROI to see who was getting the budget for it. It was an awful, experience. So I love the idea that you're looking at what problems can we solve, and understanding that if this is a big enough problem, then we're going to have a good enough solution, then we don't have to worry about the financial part of it. It's going to come.
Yeah. And by the way, and this is where, it's true. And it's also, this is how sort of where business strategy and sort of cultural strategy or cultural definition, I think, are inexorably linked, right? Because you go all the way back to kind of the genesis of Amazon, and Jeff Bezos, has asserted from the beginning that the company was always going to invest for the long term, right? That it wasn't going to be focused on quarterly results. And even when it became a public company, the same tenets, the same attitude has been maintained over time. And so, I think without that DNA, right? Without that cultural DNA that then informs how you're able to operate a business differently, right? And then we could get into an existential argument about like, well, can we act that way because we're successful, or are we successful because we act that way? I think that's a tough chicken and egg question to try and resolve, but it seems to be working.
Yeah. So do you think AWS would be as successful today if it wasn't associated with Amazon? Like, I think Amazon was kind of, you almost like AWS had built this product to support Amazon and prove that it was valuable and successful for something so large that could scale up so much at holiday seasons and handle that. Then they were able to kind of pivot and sell these services. Do you think it would be that successful if it was something that just came out of nowhere?
Probably. Well, let me see. It's a really good question that I think about a lot. And I think the answer is, I don't think it would be as successful as fast as it's been, but I think it would be every bit as successful. Because AWS has become such kind of the cloud generally, and AWS as the pioneer, has become sort of ubiquitous in how we think about things. Again, you've been around long enough to remember the days when a startup had to go out and, the first $500,000 that they raised and needed to be, earmarked to buy servers to stick in a closet somewhere, as opposed to now where you just swipe a credit card and off you go. I mean, that's a like seminal shift that I think in whatever parallel universe you might be looking at, is still going to be, it's tapping into this, $4 trillion addressable market where, it just makes accessibility to resources so straightforward and simple that I think it would be successful. I think the advantages that it had obviously was, Andy Jassy, when he wrote the first, document to get funding to build S3, EC2, and DynamoDB, didn't have to go out and convince a bunch of venture capitalists and deal with a bunch of external board members. They didn't have all the overhead of that, one. And two, a lot of that infrastructure had, like, to what we were alluding to earlier, had already been built, right? Again, one of the things that Amazon does over and over and over again for all of its businesses is kind of think about it in terms of a platform. And so, if it's going to build a retail business, it's going to build it in a way that enables, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of retailers to also tap into those resources. Similarly, the underlying technology platform that became AWS, is built in a way that makes those APIs easily accessible from anybody who wants to consume them. The same with our fulfillment business, and the same with our Prime Video business, and on and on. So, it definitely had a running start and didn't have to deal with a bunch of the overhead that, a startup from whole cloth would have to deal with. But I do think, it tapped into an opportunity that was so massive and so untapped that it still would have been successful. Now, I don't think it would have gotten to $80 billion in revenue in 17 years, but I think it would still be, a huge return for whoever happened to invest in it.
Yeah, I feel like AWS is almost synonymous for cloud these days. It's almost like the Kleenex for cloud. Or
Totally.
Yeah, and I feel like, being the fact that I'm a customer for AWS plus other cloud providers, that I see that it's almost like other cloud providers are kind of following suit and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and then adapting a little bit from that. Do you feel pressure from some of the other large cloud vendors that are out there, kind of that they're right there on your heels, or do you feel like you guys have such a big head start that you're going to continue to be the leader in the space?
Yeah, it's a good question. So at Amazon, what we talk about is that we're customer obsessed and we're competitor aware, right? So we don't spend a lot of time, focused on what our competitors are doing and making sure that we're, keeping pace. And again, we have the great luxury of not having to worry about that because, we did have such a head start out of the gate. And so, but at the end of the day, we're very focused on solving big customer problems. And we feel like, if we continue to do that, we'll just continue to maintain, our lead. I think, we don't underestimate the capabilities and the expertise of, some of the other cloud people who are building, cloud solutions as well. But it's not something we spend a whole lot of time focused on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are some practical advice that you would have for team leaders or engineering managers or directors of IT that are out there that are interested in having some better culture for their team and developing something. Maybe they're not getting the the support from above like you guys had at Amazon, but they wanted to develop their own kind of technology culture in a way that's a better fit for them. What advice would you have to someone that's in that position?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question because, in my opinion, people spend, a disproportionate amount of time making sure that they have a really strong business strategy, but it's essential that you spend as much time worried about building a strong company culture, because the reality is that, and one of my experiences at BitCasa is when, you're CEO of a struggling company, one of the things that you become acutely aware of is that great people can work anywhere they want to work, right? And so, we talk all the time about building a good team and making sure you have the right team, and that's very true. But the thing that's going to keep teams around is if they really believe in, it's good that they believe in your business. It's essential that they believe in your culture. Because when we talk about the best people, what we have to acknowledge is that eventually people can get jobs anywhere, whether it's with the next hot Gen AI startup or with AWS or with whomever. And there's certainly a transaction that needs to happen and you need to pay people a living wage. But at the end of the day, people are going to work on the things that they want to work on. And they're going to want to, and they want to work in cultures that they want to work in. And so, I think the biggest piece is really, it's as much about creating an environment where people, feel passionately about what they're working on and who they're working with, as much as it is, the next cool technology or the next great market opportunity that you might be going after. I'll tell you, I got a great, it was the first board meeting when I took over BitCasa, and this was actually before the emergency board meeting, but the board member from my second largest investor, who's this wonderful older gentleman who's been around for years and years and years, kind of pulled me to the side and said, look, he's like, here's the thing about being a CEO. This is your first time, and here's my advice. All CEOs are benevolent dictators. Great CEOs know when to be benevolent and when to be a dictator. That's always stuck with me. So that's one. The second bit of advice from a totally different environment was, I have two daughters. They both played soccer when they were younger, and let's say my younger daughter was on a soccer team that had a very aggressive parent community. So there was a lot of cheering and encouragement and, parent coaching happening from the sidelines. And this was, of course, in, first or second grade. And their wonderful coach, Coach David, had to call a parent meeting to get everybody to calm down a little bit on game day. And he pulled us all into a circle and he said, look, at SF United, which is the name of the club, we really are focused on each of your kids individually, because we think something is really important. He said, we think it's really important that we coach the child you have, not the child you wish you had. And I've always loved that advice because I think it's true, not only of like second grade soccer team, but in your life and certainly in business, right? And, as much as we might wish we had, all the best engineers or all the best salespeople, more frequently than not, we're in environments where we don't. And so being acutely aware of the team that you have and coaching that team, managing that team, rather than, getting super frustrated because, you don't have the team you wish you had.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And, I've seen that many times where you'll have to lead the people that you have, depending on whatever the skill sets are. Sometimes it means you have to communicate differently to certain people than you do other people. Some people need it in an email. Some people you have to have that face-to-face conversation, and it all depends on the team and the person that you're talking about. I think that's great. So having children myself that play sports, it really kind of relates. I can relate to the parents on the sideline there. And I found there's so many little things that you take from, being a parent and being a coach that transcends over into the work environment. Do you have any more stories or any more ideas of things like that you've used either as a parent that have kind of bled into the way that you manage and lead people?
Oh, that's a good question. Uh, I
Here, I'll give you one real quick so while you're thinking about it. So one of the things that my wife and I were doing this, I don't know, it was like a parenting book that we were reading together back when we first had our second child. And one of the tips in there was to ask your kid, what's your plan for? And the whole concept was, instead of just yelling at your kid for not doing something, sometimes you need a gentle reminder just to say, what's your plan for cleaning your room? To let them know that you didn't forget that they're supposed to be cleaning the room, and to give them an opportunity to come up with, some responsible response of how to clean your room without you having to yell at them all the time for not doing it. Yeah. So I use that all the time wherever I've, asked someone about, hey, I need, some documents completed, or I need this, new network diagram, completed, or this new application data flow, and I don't get it. Then I can say, so what's your plan for getting me that, X, Y, Z? And that lets them know that I didn't forget about it, but I'm also not yelling at you,
Yeah.
And hopefully they do have a plan. And if they don't, it's pretty obvious.
I think that's great. And little did your listeners know that they were going to be getting not just some geek leader advice, but also parenting advice.
Yes.
But I will say, I think all that's true. And the other thing you figure out, especially, I have two daughters who I love equally and are entirely different people. And the same thing true of the people that you're going to manage, which is the what's your plan for, maybe it's a universal language, but my suspicion is that may work with some people and more direct approaches may work with others.
Yeah.
You just have to really understand, like I was saying before, the team you have, not the team you wish you had.
Yeah. My middle son, he's the one that will give you the answer to your question, but still not do it.
Yeah.
So say, oh, well, this is my plan. I'm just not going to execute it.
Yeah.
So yeah, you definitely have some of that for sure. So when it comes to the future of AWS, and what's you guys' strategy going forward? Because I hear things all the time about, how big AI is and how much, we also need to be concerned a little bit about the data or the energy consumption that's going on when it comes to AI and things like that. What is the strategy that AWS is taking?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's impossible to not pay probably too much attention than you should to sort of the innovation that's happening in AI and Gen AI.
Right.
I happen to be of the camp that I do think it's going to be truly revolutionary technology. I also happen to be in the camp of people who don't believe that it's going to be happening tomorrow. And I think we've gone through like a lot of these new kind of phases and new phases of innovation. We had this beginning of the year, really understandable and deserved spike in interest, driven by ChatGPT and some of the capabilities that they were able to show, which, started with everybody thinking, oh, this is magic. And then kind of everybody realized, some of the limitations and the security concerns and and capabilities of the technology, and have taken, especially some of our larger enterprise customers who have really interesting use case. Oh, and also realizing the costs of doing all these things. Right? So people start doing some of these experiments, and suddenly the bill shows up, and they realize that maybe the ROI isn't quite there yet. I do believe that over time it's going to be transformational technology. AWS is investing, as we always do, in sort of the broadest and deepest set of tools. And I think, unlike some of our competition, want to give our customers the choice of using the tools that, work best for them, not necessarily are the tools that are owned by us. And so, giving them the freedom to use, a number of different foundational models, and a number of different large language models, and doing it at a price performance layer that, that others can't, just because we built our own, custom silicon, like Inferentia for inferences and training for training. In any event, not to turn this into an AWS ad, but I do really like the approach that we're taking. It is, we're all challenged right now with the limitation of GPU capacity. And so that's sort of a governor right now on people's ability to innovate at scale. But we see that kind of clearing up over time. To your specific issue around power, it's true. And, part of the reason that we're very focused on, not just innovating our own technology all the way down to the silicon, but also in parallel for all of Amazon, not just AWS, is, having signed the climate pledge and having, very defined targets for when we're going to be carbon neutral and when we're actually start sort of returning energy to the grid, is something that, is something that's been a vision of the company for years and years and years, and isn't going to change just because Gen AI comes along. So, we continue to be really focused on doing what we're doing in a customer obsessed way, that also is sustainable over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm in the same camp as you. I love, to see the things that have come out with ChatGPT and such like that. And, and I use it too. I used it this morning to help me craft a better sounding email. Yeah. But I also don't see it as being game changing tomorrow. It's gonna happen eventually. I go back to the model of, Tesla's full self-driving. I've been a Tesla customer for 4 years now. I paid for full self-driving 4 years ago, and I still don't have something that does much more than keep me in the lane, because it's going to take time to get there. There's going to be a lot of limitations and a lot of small little things that you're going to find that aren't quite there yet. So
and by the way, that self-driving car that conversation has been going on for 10 years. I remember Bill Gurley, the very famous venture capitalist at Benchmark, and who, VCs tend to be pretty promotional in their talk about, new technologies and innovations. But he was looking around and seemed to be the only measured one in the room, saying things like, look, we may be able to get to 0 to 90%, but the problem is that 10% kills people, and
Yep.
So it's that last bit. And I would, there's some corollary to that around Gen AI, which is, the first 50%, which is, oh my God, look at the pictures this could develop, or look at the, I don't know, pretty crappy resume this can crank out. That's fine. The problem is that next 50%, no less that last 10%, is really, really hard and just takes time. And so I think your analogy to the self-driving cars is exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying for about 10 years that self-driving cars is about 10 to 15 years away, and I think it's still about 10 to 15 years away.
That's right.
It's like we just moved the goalpost down.
Yeah. The thing is, as always with these sorts of things, like it's not there until it is, right? And so, the self-driving car isn't there until it is, and then suddenly your life changes, and the machines won't become sentient until they do, and then we're all doomed. But
yeah,
I don't know if I suspect that's going to be 50 years out, and then our kids will just have to deal with it.
Yeah, that'll be my kids and grandkids' problem, probably.
Exactly.
Well, I'll go back to the Matrix. Who knows? So, Tap, this has been a great conversation. How can people connect with you online, learn more about the things that you guys are doing at AWS, and just find out more?
Yeah, well, certainly, for those of you who haven't been there before, go to aws.amazon.com to learn more about AWS and the cloud and what we do. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm thrilled to be connected with whoever wants to reach out.
Awesome. And I'll link that in the show notes too at geekleader.com so people can click through and find you there. Again, Tap, thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.